Hi, and good evening. Thank you all for joining. We have had a lot of new folks here tonight, and so I'm gonna first start by introducing myself and the Secure Families Initiative, and then we'll launch into the training. So I am Sarah Streyder. I am the proud spouse of an active duty airman. I'm also the 2020 AFI Quantico Spouse of the Year, as well as the founder and director of the Secure Families Initiative, which you can see from our super high-tech background back here. The work we do at SFI is centered around the civic engagement portion of the military family lifestyle. So our mission is to mobilize military spouses and family members as active voters and advocates for their community. We do that in a number of ways. As you can see here tonight, we host free, nonpartisan online trainings on different topics related to being the best advocate that you can be. Up until tonight, our most popular topic had been how to tell your story to a non-military audience. But of course, this one's blown it out of the water tonight. At SFI, we also talk a lot about voting because we think it's important for those who can vote to vote. And so we answer lots of questions about how to register, especially if you're an active duty family who moves around a lot. Things can get tricky. There's lots of resources on our website. We also hosted a virtual Q&A at the Federal Voting Assistance Program last week, and we're hoping to do more events with them in the future. Finally, as an organization, we like to practice what we preach. So we don't just say it's important for military families to be advocates, we also provide actionable opportunities for them to do so. At SFI, we believe it's especially important for our community to participate in our country's conversations about foreign policy, because decisions about war and peace directly impact us here at home. So occasionally, if you follow us, you'll see that we will send out action alerts when something relevant to those topics come up. If you have any questions at any point during my presentation tonight, feel free to stick them in the chat, or you can use the Q&A function in the webinar format. My teammate, Kate Marsh-Lord, who's in the background being our master producer this evening, she will keep track of whatever questions are being asked. And so when I pause at certain parts of the presentation to take questions, she'll make sure I see everyone that comes through. A big FYI for everyone who's on the call this evening, we are recording this session. We usually don't record our webinars because usually they're smaller groups and we want to encourage folks to feel as comfortable as possible with participating. But because there are so many families that are in tough time zones and can't join tonight, and this is obviously a topic that's really important for a lot of us to talk about right now, we wanted to make sure that these materials were as accessible to them as possible. So please keep that in mind when you ask your questions. Without further ado, let's go. All right, so today we are here to talk about politics, the do's and don'ts when you are attached, married, part of the military family. What do I mean when we talk about politics? Politics can encompass a wide range of activities. There's voting, the most basic, expressing your opinions either in person or on social media. There is advocating for legislation. There's supporting a candidate. And of course, there's running for office yourself. We talk about this ladder of engagement because at SFI, of course, we believe that all of these activities are good, important, dare I say, fun to do. But we understand that the level of engagement will look different for everyone. So even though we'd love to get everyone up to the top, we would love to see a lot more military spouse and family representation in elected office. We recognize that's not for everyone, and we just want to make sure that the decision you make about how involved in politics is a decision that's made out of information rather than fear. That is our purpose here tonight. Now, there's an important distinction. There's a dividing line along this ladder between what I like to call capital case, uppercase P politics and lowercase p politics. And that distinction, that line, has to do with another P word, partisanship. Partisanship refers to the promotion of a political party or candidate for office. And those are the kinds of activities that the Department of Defense cares the most about managing for reasons that we can all probably understand. So Partisan political activities are different from, say, other forms of activism that aren't tied to a political party, such as participation in a social movement. That's not partisan political. So I'm going to flag this distinction right now up top, and later on, I will show places in which this distinction comes in handy. Before I go too much further, I do want to acknowledge the moment that we're in right now, because I know a lot of folks that are joining us for the first time here tonight are doing so because they feel a deep and justified outrage at the prevalence of racism in this country. And they want to know how they can get involved in speaking out against it. And so while we normally focus our presentation on electoral types of political activity, we did try our best to include material tonight that's responsive to this moment more broadly. I wanted to highlight instances of leadership that we've seen exhibited in this moment. First, by Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force Wright, who has spoken emphatically about his lived experience about being a Black man in America, and along with Air Force Chief of Staff Goldfein, have been spearheading tough interactive conversations about racism within the Air Force and ways that we can do better. Also, yesterday, the Army's top civilian, enlisted, and officer all together released an open letter affirming Americans' constitutional rights to peaceably assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. I point out these examples because I want to emphasize here tonight that being anti-racist does not make you partisan. And the words and actions from these leaders demonstrate that. All right, now we're going to launch into the meat of the training, what all y'all are here for. For the first portion of this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the official hard and fast rules governing political activities, because that's the first step. And later in the presentation, we'll get to the squishier social norms piece. But in answer to this fellow's lovely question, aren't there rules against this sort of thing? In short answer for you, not really. Here's what I mean. If you are the partner, spouse, or family member of someone in the military, but you yourself are not in the military or otherwise employed by the federal government, none of the rules that are about political activity apply to you. Whether we're talking about the Hatch Act or DoD Directive 134410, which I have read so many times I can practically see the text in my dreams, those rules do not govern you or your activities. They only govern your uniformed loved one and their activities. Now, before you think, cool, we're done, that was a weirdly short webinar, there are ways in which you, as a spouse or family member, your life might overlap with the life of your uniformed loved one, such that your activities might be construed as coming from them. And those are the things that you should avoid so that your spouse doesn't get dinged for breaking a rule. Does that make sense? So it's not about whether you would be breaking a rule, because again, rules aren't for you. It's about keeping a separation between you and your person, which will hopefully make more sense when I start giving examples. But I want to make sure that I'm setting the correct paradigm right at the top. Before I get into very specific examples, I do want to spell out the big picture purpose behind all of the specifics. So, because all of the little rules that we're going to talk about really all point back to one big overarching value, and that's this. We need to not do anything that gives the impression that a party or candidate is endorsed by the US Armed Forces. Every other little rule is a way of hopefully attaining this end. And in practicality, if you ever find yourself flirting close to this ultimate line, I would just say it never hurts to clarify with a very explicit disclaimer that the opinions or activities that you are doing do not, in fact, imply this endorsement. Okay, big principle established. Now let's talk about some of these specific examples. So here are restrictions that, again, do not apply to you, but may in fact overlap with the life of your spouse or family member. If your spouse wears a uniform, they are not allowed to participate in political activities while in uniform. So while you, a uniformed spouse might want to attend, let's say, a presidential rally. You can do that. And you can even bring your spouse with you as long as they participate as a spectator, but they can't do it in uniform. So just make sure you keep that in mind next time you pass along that invitation. Next, so if you live on base, there is a prohibition on political activities while on base that apply to everyone, whether you're the military service member, a family member, or even if you're non-military affiliated and you just happen to be on base for some reason. So if you want to, let's give some examples. If you want to host a fundraiser for a candidate or a phone banking session, let's say, that sort of thing, make sure that you do that off base. I know some groups of spouses who will say, hey, let's meet at the Ruby Tuesday down the road, or the Scooters Coffee just around the corner from base. Having kind of an off-base hub for whatever political activities you want to get involved in is the best workaround. Now, here's the first time where this partisan distinction comes into play that I was talking about. This prohibition does not apply to other forms of volunteer organizing that are unrelated to a campaign. So, like if you have a gathering of a group because you want to go carpool together to join, let's say, peaceful protests. That's not a partisan political activity, and that's something that you can do on base. Now, if you live on base, one other rule. You are not allowed, sadly, to post any sort of yard sign in favor of a candidate or party. Now, this, again, does not apply to yard signs that have to do with other values, principles that are not related to a campaign. But it does mean if you get involved with campaigns, you can't put that candidate sign on your lawn. Now, you'll notice I added a few asterisks, and that's because I want to give a caveat. It's possible that this restriction extends to your house if your uniformed service member lives with you, even if you live off base in completely private, non-military housing. The reason I say it's possible is because I have received that interpretation of the language from an Air Force Base's legal office before. So for the sake of providing the most safe and cautious version of the rules, that's why I'm flagging it for folks here tonight. That said, I know that there are other legal offices levels, both in the Air Force and other branches, that have interpreted it differently, that it does not apply to completely private off-base housing. And so we are actively seeking clarification from a higher level, ideally at the DoD level, on whether or not off-base non-military housing would apply. So for now, all I can say is stay tuned. I hope to get you a more concrete answer in the future. We are working the best that we can with what we've got. All right, back on track. So again, those are things that apply mostly if you're on base. So now, here's a great situation where if you have a car and you are the only person in your family who ever drives that car, you get to put whatever signage on that car that you want. However, if your spouse also drives the car, you share custody of the car, and your spouse drives that car on base, there is a limit to the amount of partisan political signage that can be on that vehicle, and it is limited to a bumper sticker. So again, it's a rule that will only apply to you if your life overlaps with your spouse's life in this way. Some people have a shared Facebook account with their spouse or a shared email account. I personally do not. So I am allowed to fundraise for political money from my personal email and my personal Facebook. But if I had a shared account that included my military service member in that account, just be aware that they cannot solicit political money, and therefore you cannot solicit political money from that same platform. Now, I've added this item here because I know we have some international listeners on this recording, and I know that protests are something that some folks might want to participate in right now. And so I wanted to clarify here that allowances regarding demonstrations, either on or off post, depend on which country you're currently stationed in. So, for example, I know that in Germany, Military personnel, and this does include civilian family members, are not permitted to participate in protests either on or off base. However, one of our webinar participants, who is stationed with her spouse in Canada right now, reached out to share that their country agreement does allow them to join off-base demonstrations. So the best rule of thumb, reach out to someone either in your command or the legal office at your installation to clarify what the rules are for you in a foreign country based on the country you're in. Now, I will flag, if you want to run for office, there are some additional rules that you'll have to keep in mind. Things like your spouse can't help you on your campaign. Again, you can't do political activities on base. If you live on base housing, you're gonna have to find a different place for your headquarters. But this is where our expertise at SFI ends and another organization's begins. I'd love to elevate and highlight our partners at Homefront Rising. They're an excellent organization that help train military spouses who want to run for office, because yes, that's a thing you can do. They are an outshoot of the Military Spouse JD Network, which is a network of military spouse lawyers who have done phenomenal work on licensing issues across different states. So if you want to run for office, I would strongly recommend you get connected with them. Under normal circumstances, they do an annual summit event in DC. This year, of course, it had to be virtual, but it's a great organization to get involved with. So far I've been a Debbie Downer talking about all the very few things you cannot do. But of course that means that there are numerous other things that you can do. And the purpose of this slide is not to provide an exhaustive list. It's not even to have this up closely enough that you can read each individual item. Rather, my hope is that this slide overwhelms you with the number of options that remain available and accessible for you as a military spouse and family member. Okay, I'm about to pivot between the hard and fast rules into those social norms that I flagged. But before I do, I have an observation, and then I'm gonna pause to answer any questions we have about this first half so far. So my observation is this. You've probably noticed sometimes there's ambiguity in these rules. And that's because the question about whether these types of rules extend to family members is a relatively modern question. It was pointed out to me just today that it wasn't that long ago that in the military, it was socially accepted expected that the military head of the household would speak for usually his family, and it was less commonly conceived of that a spouse could have often her own opinions or work. So the legal legacy that we've inherited is one that remains less than fully clear on all counts. So again, what I can promise you is that SFI, we are going to keep digging and pushing for clarifications when we feel that they are needed. And anytime that we receive any updated guidance that changes some of the things that we talk about here, especially on that yard signs piece that I mentioned earlier, we will make sure to post about it on our social media so that folks stay up to date. So Kate just messaged me a question. Is it permissible to drive a car with a partisan political bumper sticker while living on base? Like I said, the rule about partisan signage on a vehicle states that you can have a partisan political bumper sticker, but no bigger or no different from that dimensions. It's actually weirdly specific that a bumper sticker is okay, something else is not. Whether that extends to while you live on base, I believe the answer is yes. If you live on base, that's fine because it talks about a vehicle that is driven on base. So, good question, clarifying. Okay. So the next question we've got, is it no, sorry, I already did that one. If she doesn't speak to it, I'm curious how we can get involved in politics if we don't currently live in the US, which is a great question. Kate and I have both talked about this because I know Kate has spent 10 years of her military spousehood living abroad. And there have been times, Kate has told the story a few times, there have been moments where she really wanted to get involved and she tried to join organizations or campaigns from abroad and found it really difficult to do sometimes because they don't have absentee voting, overseas living military spouses in mind most often. I know that Kate has gotten to get involved by writing postcards, which is a nice thing that you can do from anywhere in the world. You don't have to be awake at the same time as someone in a different time zone like you do for, say, text banking or phone banking. So if the question is trying to get at practically what are things that you could do while you're currently living, that you don't currently live in the United States, the answer is we're actually going to be trying and helpful with that. So if there's a campaign that you want to get involved with or an organization and it's become difficult, we might be able to put you in touch. But if what you're talking about is legally feasibly, a lot of these same rules that we talked about tonight will apply to you, even if you're stationed overseas. And any more specifics will likely come from that Status of Forces Agreement, or SOFA, that I mentioned. And so the best bet is to read the specifics for your country and reach out to us if you have questions. If let's say you are in Germany right now and you want more specifics, give us an email or shoot us a call and we might be able to get more information for you to be helpful. Is there a difference with leadership command spouses? This is a good question. And the answer is, in writing, ultimately no. But we're going to talk in this next portion of the presentation about some of the unwritten rules or the squishier social norms that I think play into this question. So if you don't mind hanging in for a little bit longer, I'll refer to that when I get there. Wow, we've got a lot of questions tonight. This is awesome. Y'all came prepared. How about vulgar language relating political figures on base vehicles? So, yeah, good question. I wouldn't advise it, is what I'll say to that. In terms of whether someone else you know is doing this and you want to know if they can get in trouble or not, you know, I don't know that there is a line of code that refers to this specifically, but I do know, I want to say I've read something about if someone's in office and you know what? I'm going to go ahead and say I'll get back to you on that. I don't think there's a rule against it, but there might be something adjacent to it that would apply. So let's flag that for follow-up if that's all right. Can we have on-base demonstration or just meet on base to go to a demonstration? As far as I know, political demonstrations should be happening off base. Even though it's not a partisan political activity, I think there's another part of the DoD directive that refers to that. So I would recommend if you're trying to organize one, it's best to be off base for the demonstration itself. But of course, organizing, prepping, and carpooling, all of that can happen on base ahead of time. Where can we locate the SOFA information? Yeah, so first of all, feel free to contact someone at the base where you're at. Certainly someone, if you're in the Air Force, at your Air Force Family Readiness Center, or if someone through your FRG, all of those people should have access to these documents. I'm pretty sure they're a Google away as well. Most of the SOFAs are publicly accessible, at least the stuff that would relate to rules that you would have to follow. But if you have trouble tracking one down for some reason, again, let us know and we will do what we can to try and help you with that. In the beginning, there were comments that referenced partisan political activities are different than, one came after that. Partisan political activities are different from other forms of social activism. So, For instance, advocating a cause that has nothing to do with a political party. So let's say you're going to one of the peaceful protests that are happening right now that are not affiliated with a party and often aren't in reference to any elected or challenger leader running for office. Those are examples of social activism that fall outside the partisan political definition. So I just wanted to make sure and specify that where restrictions exist for partisan political, they don't for nonpartisan activities. Okay, I think I've answered all of the ones in the Q&A section. Apologies if I missed it. Again, please follow up. We'd be happy to chat offline. And because we are hitting that halfway point, I am going to go ahead and launch into the next section. Thank you all again exceedingly for your patience. We want to keep this as an ongoing dialogue, so hopefully this isn't the last we hear of you. Okay, so now we're going to talk about that squishy stuff. And I want us to have some real talk here. It'll probably come as no surprise to anyone on this call to hear that the #1 concern we hear from military family members about whether they should be political doesn't usually have to do with official rules. And it's this. If I can get my screen to work. That even if activities aren't technically against the rules, that they might violate certain social norms or upset someone in their chain of command who then decides they want to behave petty. If this isn't a fear that you have yourself, congrats. It probably is a fear, though, that you've heard from someone else. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to share with all of you some of my thoughts about this concern in hopes that they might be helpful as you wrestle with these things. I'm not saying that there's a right or wrong answer as soon as we step out of the objective legal stuff and into this squishier stuff, but I want to be as helpful as I can, and I think I've done a lot of thinking about it, and I just hope that some of these thoughts can spark inspiration. So first of all, first thought, I do want to clarify that all of the stuff that we focus on here at SFI, it's nonpartisan civic engagement and advocacy. So like voting, telling your story, any action item that we send to our members is perfectly compatible, if not actively encouraged within the military ethos. So I want folks to feel comfortable with that. So yeah, secondly, I want to emphasize that you are an independent entity from your spouse. Your beliefs, your opinions, your extracurricular activities are yours and yours alone. Anyone who tells you otherwise should speak to the ACLU, even though I know in practicality they probably will not. But the third thought is this. The overwhelming majority of stories that I've heard from spouses is that they are out and proud about their core political values and have expressed those outwardly for a long time without facing any retribution. I, of course, have heard the occasional horror story, but those are much fewer and further between. So even if you don't see or know that many political spouses yourself, I can assure you that we're out there and that you're not alone. And like I said, countless of us, and I'm gonna give you some examples later in the presentation, but countless of us are very open about what we think and have found it to be not a negative, rather a positive experience in our military lifetime. My fourth thought is this: tone can go a long way. Hear me out. I discovered early on when I was showing my parents our SFI website and the blog post that we had written that it's really easy for non-military folks to hear what can be justified criticism or complaints as disrespectful, even though that's not what they are at all. And I found that when I remind, especially non-military folks, that the reason why I advocate for change is that I love and respect the military as an institution and this country, and that I want both to be the best versions of themselves that they can be, both now and for future generations of military families. When I remind folks about that, I think that helps them hear me for what I am saying rather than for what I'm not. So if that's a helpful strategy to kind of add to your toolkit, I'm not saying it's always going to be appropriate or easy, because really this should all be very obvious and implied, but you shouldn't have to clarify. But if clarifying helps, I want it to be helpful for you as well as it has been for me. And my final thought is this. Ultimately, it's a personal decision how involved or not you want to be in politics and activism. It's up to you what your comfort level is, and it's important to have conversations with your family as well. And it's okay if that changes over time. We're all on a journey, and I think there are different circumstances that might influence that. So for instance, someone asked earlier about the difference between leadership and command spouses versus non. I think that's a perfectly valid reason to decide, hey, I'm in a position of leadership. A lot more eyeballs are on me. I'm under a lot more scrutiny. I want to take a bit more of a backseat this time. That's a perfectly valid choice that I know personally some folks make. I don't think it's a choice you have to make. So just to be clear on that. But other things might affect your choice too. Maybe just based on where you're stationed, you feel less or more inclined to be out and vocal. Maybe the state of current events at some point inspires you to want to get more involved than you had previously. All of that is very valid, and it's okay to step up and step out. I think that's another way that we all avoid burnout as we all try and get involved in issues that we care about. So those are my main thoughts on this. I know probably none of that is a slam dunk answer to some of the lingering concerns that folks have. But I want to add this. So if someone tells you to your face that political advocacy is somehow antithetical to the military's ethos, I could not disagree more. And here's why. Telling our stories is one of the most patriotic ways that we as spouses and family members can support our service members. And here's what I mean. At its core, that's what political advocacy is. It's storytelling. It's relaying facts about how policies have affected our lives and relaying those facts to leadership so they fully understand the downstream effects of their decisions. We all know that the military loves its briefings, right? Well, think of advocacy sort of like a briefing. You're making sure our leadership is fully briefed on the outcomes of their decisions. I also want to offer this paradigm shift real quick. Rather than seeing my military spousehood as a liability when it comes to politics, I've come to see it as a privilege and a responsibility, because we have the freedom to tell stories that our spouses can't. We get to bridge the civ-mil divide so that all voices can be fully represented within decision-making. And so I know for myself, and I've heard that this is true for a number of other spouses, we've heard from our active duty friends and loved ones that they're grateful when we speak up for things that they wish they could but couldn't. That might in fact even be the case for you, and I sure hope it is. Okay, one other concern we hear from folks, nothing to do with the spouse or career. No, it has to do with us and our desire for friendships and relationships. The military family lifestyle can be really lonely at times. Boy, can I relate to that. And so you may be thinking to yourself, well, what if being political makes it harder to either make or keep friendships? I used to live and work in DC at the very beginning of my career, and then I moved to Nebraska to join my spouse who was stationed there. And I thought at the time that there was no way I was going to meet anyone who could understand what I had worked on, or let alone support or agree with it. I thought that it was going to be part of my life that I was going to have to hide. So a few thoughts, spoiler alert, it worked out, but a few thoughts in response. Part of this from myself and part of this from, again, my teammate Kate, who wrote a fantastic article about this topic that I will talk about later. She started by quoting Dr. Brene Brown, who says that authentic friendships are the ones that you can share your vulnerability with. So maybe you just have to think to yourself, would you want to be friends if you can't be your full vocal self with that person? Maybe, or maybe not. I'll say from my experience, even if someone you meet may be startled at first by what you say you believe in or have worked on, over time, they're likely going to realize that you are a normal person. You are not that demonized version of whatever political trope that they might have in your head. And over time, being your authentic self in that relationship with others can actively help to erode stereotypes that folks have had in the past. So think of it as kind of a long-term mission. You're playing the long game here. And in fact, I'll just add thirdly, you might be surprised by how quickly speaking up on something makes you a beacon for other folks who have been quietly behind the scenes thinking the same thing, who might emerge from the woodwork to say thank you. I know that's happened to my teammate Kate a lot, especially. She's told me about how she'll post something on social media and a spouse that she's met will say, "Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you posted that. I believe it too, and I didn't know if we were allowed to say that," yada, yada. And there you go, the beginning of a bright new friendship founded in shared values. It can be a really beautiful thing. So I certainly hope that you have the same experience as I know we have. It's not always going to be this rosy, but if you stick around long enough, it might. All right, I'm going to end today by giving some examples because I think we could all use some inspiration. I have countless examples of spouses I know who've gotten involved in very apolitical advocacy. We talk a lot about these during our lobbying or leadership webinar, but I figured I'd add them in here too. Right here are 3 shining examples. So as many as you know, last year, Congress repealed what's called the widow's tax, or the tax on survivors' benefits. And the women in this picture are 3 of the most powerhouse spouse advocates that we have to thank for that change. They spent decades steadily advocating and are shining examples of what can happen when you get involved and don't give up. In fact, there was an article where Candace Wheeler, who's the policy director for TAPS, which is a phenomenal organization, said the most significant thing this year was the grassroots advocacy effort from the impacted spouses themselves. It was stellar. That is really what has been missing in the past. So now's our time, folks. Not a moment too soon to get involved in things that impact our lives. I also wanted to share a handful of other folks who I know personally, who I hope don't mind that their pictures are in my webinar, but these are all really prominent military spouse advocates that have all advocated on a wide range of issues. You've got Lena Steiner, who brought her 16-month-old to a congressional coffee to talk about immigration reform. You've got Lakeisha Cole, who's fabulous, who has been a champion on military spouse employment issues for a while. My teammate Kate Marsh-Lord there in the top right corner, obviously a picture just from this last weekend. And in the bottom, you've got Jeremy Hilton, amongst others, who are spouses who have testified before Congress, namely on issues of healthcare. So you are in good company if you care to get involved in a lot of this very apolitical. But I will also say, even when it comes to partisan politics, there are plenty of spouses who have served. I know one who served as a political appointee to the president, one who's been the public-facing spokesperson for a congressional candidate in Nebraska, one who's been the campaign manager for a state-level race in Oregon. There's even an active duty spouse running for Congress in Missouri this year. And I know several spouses who also hold office already. So in conclusion, no matter what it is that you're thinking of, I can guarantee that you're not alone. In fact, we recently launched what we're calling our Spotlight series at SFI, where we highlight examples of military families getting involved on issues that matter to them in order to inspire others to do the same. So if you already have a story that you'd like to tell us, please do. We love to tell all these stories to others. I didn't touch on every possible potential fear that someone could have about getting politically involved. Like I mentioned, Kate Marsh-Lord, my teammate, wrote an awesome article called Being Political While Married to the Military, where she addresses at least 2 additional fears. What if I don't know enough to take a position? And what if being political is disruptive to the military as an institution? I would definitely check out her article if you want to hear more about that. Also, I recently wrote an article about why your vote counts, no matter the election outcome. So if you're looking for a reason to vote that's not, well, that's completely self-serving, I would encourage you to check out that writing. And incidentally, both have been published in Military Families magazine. Thank you to them for helping us get out the word. If you'd like to continue this conversation, there is an event coming up next week that I have been invited to participate on. It's a military spouse political engagement panel. It will be happening on Facebook Live through our partners at Partners in Promise. This event will have a heavier emphasis on our experiences, not only mine, but also Sue Hoppin, who works on military spouse employment issues, and Michelle Norman, who works on EFMP advocacy. I'd also like to plug a couple of the other webinar topics that we do here at SFI. We've got this one on answering tough questions. How many of us dread Thanksgiving dinner because conversations with our extended family doesn't always go super smoothly? Or how many of us have been having more social media exchanges that get pretty heated pretty easily? Well, at this training, we offer a formula for how to de-escalate a situation and hopefully turn it around into a more constructive conversation. We also have a webinar on how to lobby your elected officials, a very kind of specific slice of the advocacy pie, but we talk about ways to make your advocacy of changing hearts and minds most effective. And last but not least, I will additionally plug that due to overwhelming popular demand with this topic this evening, we did add another session next Tuesday. So if you know of anyone who wasn't able to join and wants to be able to engage live with questions, please encourage them to sign up for Tuesday's session. Okay, I just realized that I completely brushed over the section where I check if anyone had questions from the second half of the presentation. My apologies. I was just getting so excited. As you can tell, I love what I do. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sit here for a little bit. I'm going to scroll through and see if folks have asked questions, and if so, if I can provide any good answers. The official portion of the webinar has concluded. Thank you everyone for tuning in and for wanting to get involved. We really encourage you to check out a lot of the other stuff that we do at SFI. Our website is on here, all of our social media handles. And just think, if you become a member, you get to see more pictures of my adorable puppy. What more would you want? Really? So anyway, I hope that it's been helpful. And like I said, I'm gonna stay here for a little bit and see if I can help answer whatever questions folks have.